Hello and welcome. I'm Andreas. I work as a trainer and consultant primarily for C++. And I'm also the creator of C++ Insights. And this is also the tool I like to talk about in this series. In today's episode, I like to show you some of the options you can select with C++ Insights. So if you click here where usually you probably only switch to standard, there are a couple of more things. In the last episode we saw how we can switch to standard library using the use libc++ mode. I also showed in a previous episode what happens if you select show all implicit casts. Today I like to talk about the for loops as while loops option and the alternative array subscription. So for the first one, I pre-coded some example here. It's just a main function with a for loop, probably a rather old style for loop. Please forgive me for that, but it's the most simplest. I declare a variable I in this for loop of type int. The for loop checks whether I is still less than 5 and it increments I with a pre-increment in each step. So far so good. I assume we all have written way too much for loops. But this one is especially for learners, for newcomers. Sometimes this is interesting to see what's behind them and to understand which part of the for loop does what. So a time ago, someone asked for this, and I also used it with students at the university. If I select this for loops as while loops option and I do the transformation, then I can see a different representation on the right. So the compiler adds, as we can see with the curly braces, scope in main. We can do that ourselves. And in that scope, it declares the variable I we requested of type int, initializes it with 0. And then inside that, I have a while loop, so even simpler loop than a for loop, which does the check I requested, is I still less than 5. And then inside that while loop, it increments I. And now we cannot see this correctly, but for example, if I create a buffer here, let's say of type 10, to just have something to do, and I index into that buffer. Don't do that at home. It's probably not the best thing. And I simply store I in there. Totally not caring about any leaks or any buffer overflows so far. So if you can, use range-based for loop version, but let's stick to that one so far. Now what we can better see is that the increment of I is in fact the last thing the compiler does in this while loop before going back and checking the loop condition. So essentially you can in your head or with paper and pencil transform every for loop into a while loop. A for loop is just a much more convenient and nicer syntax than using a while loop and having to handcraft everything ourselves. For this case, it's more or less the same. If I, say I use this buffer and I switch to a range-based for loop, and I make this buffer size 5. And because we are in C++20 mode anyway, let's say I create my variable I and initialize it with 0. Just at this time, I have to take care of incrementing it myself, but C++20, as a side note, allows us to have initializers in a for loop, in a range-based for loop. And if I now transform this, then we can see that, of course, a range-based for loop is just an easier way of writing a for loop, while a for loop is an easier way to writing a while loop, because all what we see on the right is still there. The compiler does it for us. Kudos for that. It's nice that I don't have to code this all the time and make tiny copy and paste mistakes, which result in huge errors. But if it helps you understanding what's going on, then you can use C++ insights. And if you like to know it more deep down, then you can turn on this option for loops as while loops to see how they transform. I'm not so sure if a compiler these days still does this transformation internally, or if it's just easier for it to go with a for loop and with a while loop because it knows exactly what to do. You have to look up the source code of your probably or hopefully open source compiler to figure that out. So the second thing we have as an option here is the array subscription. So showing an alternative style for an array subscription. For that, I prepared a simple example. I have an int array of size 4, and in the next line, I'm accessing the element number 3 and initialize it with 9. And when I enable this option and transform this, then we can see the thing which causes problems. For example, if we pass this array to functions, because from there we know that every array decays to a pointer. And this is true here as well. So an alternative representation, which I really request you to not write yourself, but it may be beneficial to know that, is that we can say, okay, array decays to a pointer anyway. I can add 2 to this pointer, which is the index at which we like to access the element, and then dereference it and assign 9 to it. It's the same result in the end. I claim that the left version is the one to go with because it's much more readable. But once again, this episode is a bit more for learners, for starters, maybe coming from C or thinking a bit more about the machine. Then this can help you to see what's going on there. For all these options, I think I never pointed you to the documentation. So there is docs.cppinsights.io where you can find documentation to the source code, but also other things. So if you go to contents here, then you can see a C++ Insights command line options resource. And there you can, for example, click on the alt syntax 4, which stands for alternative syntax for 4. And you can see that the default is off. And you can see here an example, more or less the same one I showed you, and the thing it transforms into. All the other options are documented as well, so this can also be a good starting point to figuring out what else you can do and what fits your needs. That's it for today. Stay tuned for the next episode. Bye bye.